Indian Council Act of 1909. This act is also known as Morley-Minto reforms. Lord Morley was the Secretary of the State for India and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India. The features of this act were as follows. It considerably increased the size of the legislative councils, both central and provincial. The number of members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60. The number of members in the Provincial Legislative Council was not uniform. It retained official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the Provincial Legislative Councils to have non-official majority. It enlarged the deliberative functions of the Legislative Council at both the levels. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. It provided for the first time for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's executive council. He was appointed as a law member. It introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. Thus, the act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. It also provided for the separate representation of presidency, corporations, chamber of commerce, universities and zamindars. Government of India Act of 1919. On August 20, 1917, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. The Government of India Act of 1919 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. This act is also known as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of the State for India and Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. The features of this act were as follows. It relaxed the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provincial subjects. The central and provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and unitary. It further divided the provincial subjects into two parts, transformed and reserved. The transformed subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the legislative council. The reserved subjects, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governors and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. This dual scheme of governance was also known as a diarchy, a term derived from the Greek word diarchy, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. It introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house, Council of State, and a lower house, Legislative Assembly. The majority of members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. It required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, other than the Commander-in-Chief, were to be an Indian. It extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax or education. It created a new office of High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of the State for India. It provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Hence, a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. It separated for the first time provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. It provided for the appointment of a statutory commissions to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. Simon Commission in November 1927 itself, 2 years before the schedule, the British government announced the appointment of a 7-member statutory commission under the chairmanship of Sir John Simon to report on the condition of Indian under its new constitution. All the members of the commission were British and hence all the parties boycotted the commission. The commission submitted its report in 1930 and recommended the abolition of diarchy, extension of responsible governments in the provinces, establishment of a federation of British India and princely states, constitution of communal electorate, and so on. To consider the proposals of the commission, the British government convened 3 round-table conferences of the representatives of the British government, British India and Indian princely state. On the basis of this discussion, a white paper on constitutional reforms was prepared and submitted for the consideration of a Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament. The recommendation of this committee were incorporated in the next Government of India Act of 1935.